Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about the female reproductive system. And the female reproductive system I can't say enough about its importance, because not only is it producing the female egg, as you can see right here, which is one of the largest cells in the body. And one of the things that's interesting about the egg is that it's a haploid. And when the sperm fertilizes it, if there's sperm present, it'll become the zygote, which will eventually become an embryo, and then a fetus, and then a baby. So basically, the female is producing the egg, which will become the future baby. And not only is the female reproductive system doing that, but it's doing a whole lot more. And so let's just jump right into that discussion. Go right in there. And so the various organs of the female reproductive system not only are specialized to undergo meiosis. In particular, the ovary is where meiosis occurs in a female, and that's where the egg is being produced. Not only is the eggs being produced in the ovaries, which are sort of these red structures here, they're attached. The ovaries are attached. They're kind of small. They're just a few centimeters in length. They're attached with an ovarian ligament. That's a ligament right there, and like, what's it attached to? This pear-shaped muscular organ is called the uterus. And inside the uterus is where the embryo will implant itself and become a fetus and a baby. And so this is where your child will develop someday, inside the uterus. I'm like, well, what's up here then? What are these tubes? These are uterine tubes coming off the uterus. Sometimes they're called oviducts, because they're also a passageway for the egg to enter into this right here. So they're oviducts, uterine tubes, but you might know them as fallopian tubes. So these are the fallopian tubes. And so check this out. Once a month, an egg is released. Whoops. Let me go with the pen here. Once a month, an egg is released from the ovary, and it's picked up by the fallopian tube. And right inside the fallopian tube, it moves down to about right there. If there's some sperm present, fertilization will take place, and then you have conception occurring right there in the fallopian tube. And so one of the things about the female reproductive system is, number one, it produces these eggs. Number two, it transports these eggs not very far, but it does transport them to a site of fertilization, which happens right about here in the fallopian tube. And then it provides a favorable environment for the developing fetus. The favorable environment is the inner layer of the uterus. It's called the endometrium. And so that thin inner layer of the uterus, which has a lot of blood vessels, is going to provide the perfect rich environment for the embryo to implant itself. And then, if that isn't enough, the female reproductive system gives birth. What's not shown here is the birth canal. This is the opening, or the cervix. So make the egg, transport the egg, a favorable place to grow the child, deliver the baby, and then on top of it all produce hormones, which help to regulate the whole thing. So, oh my goodness. So the primary sexual organ, like in the male we talked about the primary sexual organ being the testes, but in this case it's the ovary. It's where the eggs are being produced. And it's also the site of the production of two major hormones that are produced in the female reproductive system, and I might as well mention them. One hormone that's being produced by the ovary is estrogen, and another hormone being produced is progesterone. And so those are two critical hormones. There's going to be some other hormones involved, and those are produced by the brain, and in particular the pituitary gland. So here's a really cool close-up of the female reproductive system. So it's the female body sort of sliced in half, and so you can see it like this. And so let's just go right down the line here. Here you can see the ovary, which is the primary reproductive structure. This is where meiosis is occurring. Now, once a month, the egg is released during the process of ovulation, and that's picked up by the oviduct, or uterine tube, or fallopian tube, and they have these finger-like projections that sort of move rhythmically over the ovary, sort of searching to pull the egg out during ovulation, and they're lined with cilia to help that. And then they move down the egg, moves down the fallopian tube where it's fertilized. And then this big muscular organ is the uterus right there. Look at this, how muscular it is. But it's fairly small in a non-pregnant female, but it can really become enlarged to hold a 8-9 pound baby. So this can really stretch out. And see, then we're going down here. So below the uterus is the urinary bladder, not part of the reproductive system, but it's clearly right in the middle of it. Here's the urethra, right there where the urine is passed out in the body. And so over here, like in the male, there's a large bone right here called the pubic bone. And this bone right here plays a protective role. And then there's a lot of, like, below the skin fat. That's what this is, subcutaneous adipose tissue right here, over here. Now, what's interesting is if you look over here, like the opening of the uterus is called the cervix right there. If this is, three-dimensional, it's like a little circle right there that opens it up. And then here's the birth canal, otherwise known as the vagina. And so then that opens up to the outside. And so the female reproductive system is mostly internal, but there are a few structures here on the outside, and collectively it's called the vulva. And so these external female reproductive system organs play a protective role. There's two folds. This isn't the best picture, but there's two folds right here that play a protective role. They're called labia. And one is a major and one is a minor, right there. I'll come back to that. And then there's the opening of the vagina. And then there's a little structure right in here called the clitoris, which is composed of erectile tissue, which can become engorged during sexual arousal. There's a lot of sensory neurons which stimulate the female to produce mucus inside of the vagina, which helps to lubricate during sexual reproduction. So it's kind of critical. Come back to that. And so this is kind of a gruesome picture. This is the same picture that we're just looking at. See that? This is the real person. So look at this. Here's the pubic bone right there, and here's the vagina, and then here's this big opening is the urinary bladder, and then here's the uterus, and then right above that are all the intestines that are sort of chopped open here, and then here's the rectum. This is the anus right over here. So that's kind of brutal. So let's just go right into this. So the primary organ is the ovary. And so the ovary, there's two of them, and they're located off of these ligaments which are connected to the uterus right there. And one thing that I'm going to say about it is that this is normal, but sometimes tumors can occur on the ovary, and that's very dangerous. So not only is it lethal potentially for the mother who has a tumor, any cancer can be trouble, but it could also interfere with egg production. It can make the woman sterile, so it's kind of sad. And so if it's detected, the treatment might be to remove the whole ovary. And so if it's only in one, maybe that's not too bad. And then this could be a problem too. This is polycystic ovary. In other words, cysts can form here. We had talked about before, if you remember, that this polycystic event can occur on the kidney as well, and it could crowd out the normal functioning of the ovary and therefore cause problem. And this is kind of interesting too. The ovary, in addition to producing what are known as female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, they also produce a little bit of androgen as well, testosterone. And so as a result of this, sometimes a little bit too much testosterone is being produced and can cause some weird phenotypes as a result of that. You can have excessive body size and facial hair can be the result of ovarian issues. It's not dramatic. It depends on how bad it is, though, and it can also affect the menstruation cycle or menstruational. And so let's talk about the production of eggs. And so when we talk about meiosis, it's not a biology lecture, but I could spend quite a long time discussing phases of meiosis, but I won't. The production of an egg The egg is sometimes called the ova. Let me write that down because this is important. The egg is also known as the ova, but it's also known as the ovum. It can also be called the egg. Sorry for all the different names. But it could also, this is my favorite, it could also be called the oocyte. Like, uh-oh. Uh-oh-cyte. So the making of the oocyte is oogenesis. How do you like that? Sort of like spermatogenesis when we were talking about the male. So oogenesis is female meiosis. And you're like, well, what about it? Well, it's fascinating in the female because in addition to the chromosomes being halved from 46 to 23, that's one thing. Okay, that's the main event. Homologous chromosomes are separated. You create a what's called a secondary oocyte, which is haploid. And you're like, well, that's kind of interesting. Well, what's interesting about it, the thing about the female is that similar happens in a male, but what's different in a female is that when the cytoplasm divides to make these two cells right there, it's uneven, and so one cell is really huge. So the secondary oocyte's really big, and it captures a lot of the cytoplasmic organelles. And so that's really a good thing ultimately because it's this cell that's going to get fertilized by the egg. So it has kind of a good start to produce the zygote, which is the fertilized egg. This other remaining cell, it's also haploid. It's called a polar body. It eventually dies and disintegrates. It doesn't have a lot of cytoplasm. So you're sort of putting all your efforts into one cell, even though there's two that are produced right there. And then a little detail, but meiosis 2, in other words, going from chromosome to chromatids, occurs after fertilization. And so, whoa, okay, so what's interesting here is that these secondary oocytes, okay, this first part of meiotic division, this is occurring early on in your life. This is happening fetal inside when you were a baby inside of your mother's uterus. So you're producing these these cells that are what are eventually going to become the baby, but this secondary oocyte then needs to mature at puberty. And so let's go on to this conversation. So during prenatal development, okay, so when you were a fetus, there's small groups of cells inside your uterus, your little tiny uterus, that are undergoing the first stages of meiosis. And so the primary oocyte is being produced. And then this is a picture of the primary oocyte. It's still a diploid cell. And it's surrounded by this kind of unusual membrane, really thick membrane called the zona pellucida. And the reason that it has a special name is that it's important when the sperm is fertilizing it. And then the oocyte is surrounded by these epithelial cells called granulosa cells, which are very highly secretory. And so these granulosa cells will eventually be cells that are producing estrogen. These cells are capable of producing estrogen right there. And so this structure develops once a month, once puberty hits. And what's fascinating is that it receives the message from the brain. There's a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, which comes from the anterior pituitary gland. And this travels down to the ovary, and it picks up these granulosa cells. And it causes these cells to divide. At first there's just one cell layer, and then they become enlarged, and the cell itself becomes enlarged. And then these cells start secreting and secreting. What's interesting, let me show you, take a little break from this and show you a tiny video, a short video I should say, not necessarily, well, maybe tiny also, a short video of this. And so what you have going here is the fact that we're running a little low on battery. Hopefully we'll make it. So what's happening here is you get this primary follicle right in here. This it's the oocyte is inside. Then you get these granulosa cells, and then they're dividing right here. And so they become enlarged, and it forms like this cell membrane around it called the zona pellucida. And then this is occurring inside the ovary. the cells start dividing and dividing, and it starts forming a little fluid-filled vesicles inside. And then what you get here is the cells are maturing, and they're also producing estrogen as a result of it. Now, what's causing the cells in the follicle to mature? A hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, until it finally reaches a stage where, let me pause it, where you have this big reservoir of fluid filled inside, and the oocyte, this would be the secondary oocyte right here, is surrounded by what's called the well, the cells are granulosa, but the cells that are going to be released in ovulation, this cumulus mass of cells, are sometimes referred to as the corona radiata. In other words, the cells that surround the oocyte. Right there. And so the sperm has to penetrate through all those cells in order to fertilize it. And so this is really cool. Watch this. So this is still inside the ovary. Following ovulation, the cells, those granulosa cells that were not released, form this glandular material called the corpus luteum. Corpus means body, and luteum means yellow. And this gland produces a large amount of, get this little pointer here, this corpus luteum produces a large amount of estrogen and a large amount of progesterone. So that is kind of interesting. So check this out. When we let it play, then at the end of the cycle, it breaks down into a white structure called the Corpus Albicans. And so it sounds a little weird, but we'll talk in another video about how the hormones help to regulate the menstrual cycle. And this is an important event. When the corpus luteum breaks down the last week of a 4-week cycle and forms this corpus albicans, the amount of estrogen and progesterone decrease rapidly. So they like fall off in terms of blood concentration of those hormones. And as a result of that, here's a little foreshadowing, the uterus begins to shed its inner lining, and menstruation occurs as a result of that. And so that's fairly important. And so let's get back over here. Let me, for a second here, I think I'm going to be running out of battery. And so let me apologize for just a little bit of an intermission. I don't want to pause it per se, so I'm just going to, sorry about this, I'm just going to take a second and go like this. Sorry for the interruption. And just go like that. Okay, now we got plenty of battery life. Okay, so let me come over here, and so let's go back to the slideshow here. And so, if you're following this, I know it's a little tricky. It comes at you kind of strong, and so these primordial germ cells are inside the embryo itself, and they form what are known as the primary oocyte. And so this is what's happening during fetal development. And so you ready for this? So the primary oocyte undergoes meiosis, but it halts. And so there's a big break of several years. Now, when's puberty? Puberty, you know, I put puberty here in the slideshow as being 10, although that's very early. And menopause, meaning the end of menstruation, being 50, and that's kind of late. So this is a big window, 40 years of reproductive fertility. But basically, when you're born, so a female's born with all of her eggs already there in the ovary. And when I say already there, there's 400,000 oocytes right over here, primary oocytes, but only about 400 or 500 will be released one a month. And so around 400 or so, 450 eggs will be released over the reproductive lifetime. And so this oogenesis, or the production of the egg at birth, contains all these primary oocytes that you'll ever have. Then there's unequal cytokinesis, as I mentioned before. So you have this one big secondary oocyte, and then these little small polar bodies. And there's a big resting period. And so this is one of the things, I won't get into it, but I'll certainly mention it right now. It's worthy of mentioning it. this is what is some of the concerns about genetic disorders that are caused by chromosomal abnormalities. Sometimes during meiosis, the chromosomes, since they're really in this state of meiosis, between meiosis 1 and 2 for many, many years, sometimes the chromosomes don't segregate properly during anaphase, and you can have abnormal chromosome numbers in these oocytes, and it results in various aneuploidies. Like, for example, the most common is a trisomic baby, which has 47 chromosomes instead of 46, which is known as Down syndrome. So that's kind of brutal. So I like this picture. This is a cross-section of the ovary. So here's your primary follicle, and so it's developing. And so the egg is just this one little cell inside. That's the oocyte. And you're like, well, what's the whole thing? The whole thing is considered to be a follicle. And the reason that the follicle is maturing is that these granulosa cells are dividing and dividing. And what's happening is they're producing, if you recall this, these are the cells that are producing estrogen. And now they're producing even more estrogen. So the estrogen levels are going up. And the reason that the follicle is maturing is because from the brain is producing follicle stimulating hormone. So the follicle stimulating hormone is traveling through the blood vessels, causing the follicle to mature. And then, so this is happening, let's give a time frame right here. So let's say that this is approximately 1 week or 7 days. And this is another week right here, or 7 days. So on approximately day 14, which is the midpoint of a 4-week cycle, ovulation is occurring. So the mature follicle literally ruptures. The fluid is released. The secondary oocyte is released with some of the cells surrounding it. Do you remember the corona radiata? And then the follicular cells that remain become this yellow body called the corpus luteum. So this is the next 7 days, so that's 21. So this inside the ovary is really cranking out high levels of estrogen, and it's now also producing progesterone, high concentration. And so what's interesting here is that if the secondary oocyte, I'll just call it the egg, if the egg isn't fertilized within like 24 hours, then it's subject to die. And so there's a little bit of a window there where you need to be fertilized. So what's the point? And I'll come back to this a little bit later. I'll just foreshadow it. What's the point of all this high levels of estrogen and progesterone? Well, the target is the uterus. These two hormones help to develop the uterus, anticipating the potential pregnancy. Now, if there's no baby, so this last week right here, do you remember we said that the corpus luteum begins to disintegrate and it becomes this sort of whitish structure? The levels of estrogen and progesterone go down dramatically at this point. And so this is day 28 right here. So the levels of estrogen and progesterone go down. And what that does is that causes menstruation to occur. And that's the first day. So there's ovarian events and then there's uterine events. So here's a model of the ovary. I kind of like it. It shows some primordial follicles here. It shows some follicles that are developing. And then you're like, well, what the heck is that? This is how large the follicle can get. It's filled with fluid and it can literally rupture. So ovulation is literally sort of like the popping of a blister. And it's like all this fluid is coming out and the egg is being released somewhat violently with some of the corona radiata. And then here's the corpus luteum, and then here's corpus luteum breaking down. And then I like this. This is a actual ovary. So this is the ovary cut in half. Look at this. These are the fluid-filled follicles up here, causing the ovary to sort of swell up on the outside. And then here's the corpus luteum right in here. And so you could actually feel on the outside these little bulges on the outside when the follicle is about to rupture. This is a really nice shot too. Under the microscope, you can see here's the oocyte, here's the granulosa cells that are surrounding it, cumulus mass. Here's that special membrane called the zona pellucida right there that surrounds the cell. And then this is the fluid right inside here. This is a mature follicle. These are the cells that are producing estrogen. And then the main event, which usually occurs on day 14, it may not. It could occur a little bit sooner, or it could occur a little bit late. It's difficult to know exactly when ovulation takes place. It's been known that the female body's temperature raises ever so slightly around the time of ovulation. I believe it is the effect of the result of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Well, these cause ovulation, especially luteinizing hormone, the follicle to rupture. But the slight elevation in temperature, you can take, if you have a really sensitive thermometer, you can detect that. And you're like, well, who cares when ovulation? If you're looking to become pregnant, you would care, because this is when the egg is being released. And so this is where you would want the sperm to be present. So this is when you would want to be actively having sexual intercourse if you're attempting to become pregnant, is during ovulation. And so you'd want to monitor that. And so you could sort of take a look at when menstruation is occurring, and then, sort of get a read on how your cycle is going. And so here is a picture of ovulation. So there's the follicle. Here's the fimbriae of the fallopian tube reaching out and grabbing the egg. And so let's talk about some of these internal accessory organs. Accessory kind of gives them a subordinate function, but they're very important too. I know the ovary is most important. We've been talking about it a lot, but the oviduct and uterus and vagina are pretty critical too, as well as these outside structures. And so the fallopian tube, uterine tube, or oviduct is it's very thin, but it's about 4 inches long, and it's connected to the uterus. And inside, I find this to be really cool, inside, this is a scanning electron micrograph of inside a fallopian tube. And what do you see here? Lots of cilia. So the cells are secreting mucus, and kind of like pseudostratified columnar, ciliated columnar that we saw in the respiratory system, this mucus secretion in cilia sort of create a current where the egg is able to move down the fallopian tube to the site of fertilization. But as the egg moves down, here it is moving down the fallopian tube, that means that the sperm have to swim against all that mucus and against the beating of the cilia. So they're probably pretty tuckered out, and that's why a lot of them don't make it. And so just maybe a couple hundred make it out of the million that are that enter into the female body. So it's a beautiful picture of the egg inside the fallopian tube. What you don't want is, okay, fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube, but what you don't want is your little embryo to start to develop in the fallopian tube. You don't want that. What is normal is that the cells divide in what's known as a cleavage period, where you go from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells until you get a little tiny structure called a morula and then a blastula, sort of like a little blackberry, and then it implants into the uterus, and that's where the baby is supposed to develop. But if a baby develops abnormally inside the oviduct, it's called an ectopic pregnancy, and it can be very dangerous for not only the fetus but the mother. And so an awesome diagram of the whole reproductive system. So here's your ovary. We've been talking about that. Fimbriae, uterine tube. Here's this ligament. Now look at this big ligament right here. It's kind of the broad ligament. And this is really important, especially during pregnancy, which will allow the uterus to expand here. Now look at how muscular the uterus is. The uterus is made up of 3 distinctive layers. They all end in metrium. So the innermost layer is the endo. The muscle layer is myo, from the middle muscle, smooth muscle. And then peri, or on the outside, perimetrium. We like to talk a lot in this class about endometrium, because it's this endometrium that develops every month. The inside layer develops. And if you remember this, it develops because estrogen and progesterone target the endometrium, causing it to thicken. Now, why would the inner layer thicken with blood? Is because this is where the embryo is to develop. And then on day 28, do you notice here how the corpus luteum is breaking down? When there's no more corpus luteum, the levels of estrogen and progesterone go down, and therefore about, let's say, approximately 45 milliliters of blood is then released out from the uterus, out through the cervix, and out in menstruation. This doesn't necessarily happen in one day, but a couple of days. And it's known as a period because it happens fairly regularly at a certain period of time. And so that's what that is. If you're pregnant, obviously, maybe not obviously, but if you're pregnant, you want your endometrium to remain intact. And so that's a very important thing, because if you were to shed the endometrium, you would lose the embryo. So that's crucial. So one of the first signs, other than a pregnancy test, an ELISA test, that you're pregnant would be that you're not having a period. And so that's an indication that potentially you're pregnant. So look at this. This is a cross-section of the uterus. It shows how muscular it really is. This is the endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium right there. And then it coalesces right here into this really muscular collar right over here called the cervix. And when we talk a little bit more about pregnancy, we'll talk more about cervix, because the cervix dilating is rather important, and you can use that as a measure of different stages of labor. And so here, the uterus connects and is continuous with this muscular tube called the vagina. It's also known as the birth canal because it conveys the baby, like a canal where the baby comes out of the body. But really, it really conveys uterine secretions more than it does a baby. There's only a couple times a baby is going to be passing through, but mainly endometrium blood is going to be traveling through. And then there's the vagina orifice or opening. And then very early on in a female's life, there's a little thin membrane called the hymen, which protects the opening of the vagina. That's what I wanted to say about that. And so here's another back-away view of the whole internal reproductive structures. You got the vagina, the cervix, the endometrium, the myometrium, perimetrium. Here's the uterus. And so let's talk now about those external structures. And so the external structures have this labia majora, and it's basically, this is an odd photograph because it's showing, a female lying down, but it's also showing like the legs sort of spread out like that, and that isn't normally the case. Normally, legs are a little bit closer together. You're either sitting or in a standing position, and so normally you won't see the vagina opened quite like this, and this is the point. Like the functions of these labia, the large labia and the minor labia, which are these sort of pinkish longitudinal pieces of skin, they're more pink than other parts of the skin because there's a lot of blood vessels. That's the only thing about that. What's their function is really just to cover and protect the opening of the vagina. It's just an opening that germs will try to come in. There's really three openings here. There's one which allows urine to come out, which is the urethra, and then here's the birth canal opening, and then here's the anus. And so these labia protect the opening of the vagina. And so here you are again. Okay, here's again spread so you can see what's going on. So there's the opening of the urethra. Here's the vaginal opening and the anus right here. And so collectively, this is known as the vulva right here, this whole external structure. This other area right here, you can just go name crazy with anatomy. The vestibule is this area in between the urethra and the vaginal opening. And so, dramatic effect. So the labia, both major and minor, play a protective role. So they enclose and protect the organ, sort of like analogous to the scrotum would be protective to the testes a little bit. Now, I want to point out something up here that the labia sort of coalesce and they form like this little hood around the structure called the clitoris. And so I just want to point that out. The clitoris right here, you can see a close-up of it. Here's the tissue on top of it, surrounding it. most of the clitoris is internal, so it's inside the body. Just sort of the tip of it appears on the outside. So it's just a little small protrusion. And what's interesting about this structure is that it has, I mentioned this before, it has this erectile tissue. So it's capable of swelling so that it protrudes just a little bit when a female is aroused. And it's highly sensitive, sort of like the underside of the penis. It has a lot of sort of light sensory neurons, and so it's subject to tickle. And so that tickle effect releases adjacent to the opening of the vagina. There's some glands that produce mucus, and so as a result of this whole area being stimulated, a mucus develops, and therefore it makes intercourse a little bit easier. And so here's a picture, a cutaway of these glands, vestibular or vestibule area right in here has these glands that produce mucus, which help during sexual intercourse. And here's the opening of the clitoris. So, as I mentioned before, like this clitoris can become erect, but it's not going to be as dramatic as the erection of the penis, but it does become erect, and then it gets stimulated during sex. And then what can happen is, again, like in the male, now a male, just to point this out, when a male is ejaculating, that is when that orgasm is occurring. So if a male is ejaculating semen, an orgasm is accompanying it. Orgasm is not necessary for the female. You can have sexual intercourse and semen can get into the female body and there's no orgasm. It's just orgasm is something that is it's obviously encouraged to occur, but it can cause like that when it's stimulated. It can cause actual like rhythmic muscular contractions of the uterine walls, which are thought to potentially help and aid the sperm move along in the uterus. Questionable. And then finally, as I mentioned before, all of this results in mucus being produced inside, which facilitates lubrication and intercourse. So there you have it. Quick overview, I think, of the female reproductive system. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was useful. Thanks. Thanks for watching.